Well, good morning, Sunday school kids. How you doing this week? Got another story for you right out of the Bible. And good news, it's not quite as hard a story to hear and listen to as it was last week. But it is still kind of a strange story. You know, imagine if someday when you were all grown up, you had a boy or a girl who you fell really in love with, and they fell really in love with you. And you were going to get married, and you went to your wedding, and your bride or your husband had something on his face, like maybe a mask. Maybe it was during a pandemic. And then you discovered at the end of the marriage, you married somebody else. You married their brother or their sister. That'd be pretty weird, huh? That happened to a guy in the Bible. And you'll enjoy the story, and there's a great lesson to it too. But I just want to say one thing I kind of like about this story, and about a lot of stories in the Bible. It shows that God uses people who aren't perfect to do his work and his will. Sometimes we think that if we're not perfect and wonderful and incredible, then God couldn't use us. But God has plans for our life and plans for our world and plans for the church. And throughout the entire Bible, God uses people who are imperfect, who make mistakes, who do dumb things, who don't do even the things they want to do. God uses people like that all the time to do stuff that winds up being pretty cool. And that's kind of a comfort, because it reminds me that even if I'm not perfect or as good as I ought to be or do everything right, well, that maybe God can still use me. So I hope you enjoy this story of kind of a switcheroo, but also a story of how God can use people who aren't perfect to do some incredible things, and how underneath a lot of the stories in the Bible, what we find is the real truth about God's plan and God's love. And we have to look for that all the time. So enjoy this morning's story. Again, out of the book of Genesis, the very first book we find in the Bible in the Old Testament. Bye, kids. Enjoy.
The girl no one wanted. There were once two sisters. The youngest sister was very beautiful, and her name was Rachel. But the oldest sister wasn't beautiful at all. Some thought her quite ugly. And her name was Leah. Rachel was the kind of girl who always gets invited to parties and chosen for the team. Everyone loved her. And poor Leah? No one hardly even noticed her. One day, their cousin Jacob came to stay. He was one of Isaac's sons, and he was on the run. Jacob had stolen and cheated and made some enemies, including his own brother, and now he was hiding. The funny thing is, Jacob, of all people, was the one God gave the special promise to, the same promise he had given to his grandfather Abraham. I will rescue the world through your family. But then God chooses people we least expect, as we'll see. Jacob stayed a long time working for his uncle Laban. And one day, Laban said, "Jacob, I've decided to pay you for your work. What do you want?" A sudden thought struck him. "How about one of my daughters?" Jacob looked at Rachel, and he looked at Leah. Who would he choose? Of course, he chose Rachel. "I'll work 7 years for free," Jacob said, "if I can marry Rachel." So Jacob worked 7 years, and at last his wedding day arrived. But that night, Laban played a nasty trick on Jacob. Instead of sending Rachel to marry Jacob, he sent Leah. Now, in those days, they didn't have electricity, so it was dark in their tent, and besides, women wore veils, and you couldn't see their faces properly. So Jacob suspected nothing. The next morning, Jacob woke up and screamed. His new wife was lying beside him, but it wasn't Rachel, it was Leah. Jacob jumped out of bed. "Laban," he cried, "you scoundrel!" But Laban said, "Work for me another 7 years, and then you can marry Rachel." So Jacob worked for Laban another 7 years, and at last Rachel became his wife. Now Jacob had 2 wives, but of his 2 wives, Jacob loved Rachel the best. "No one loves me," Leah said. "I'm too ugly." But God didn't think she was ugly. And when he saw that Leah was not loved and that no one wanted her, God chose her to love her specially, to give her a very important job. One day, God was going to rescue the whole world through Leah's family. Now, when Leah knew that God loved her, in her heart, suddenly it didn't matter anymore whether her husband loved her the best or if she was the prettiest. Someone had chosen her. Someone did love her, with a never stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love. So when Leah had a baby boy, she called him Judah, which means, "This time I will praise the Lord." And that's just what she did. And you'll never guess what job God gave Leah. You see, when God looked at Leah, he saw a princess. And sure enough, that's exactly what she became. One of Leah's children's children would be a prince, the Prince of Heaven, God's son. This prince would love God's people. They wouldn't need to be beautiful for him to love them. He would love them with all of his heart, and they would be beautiful because he loved them. Like Leah.